Throw in the chat, we're ready.
All right. Good afternoon and good morning to our West Coast listeners. My name is Juan Thomas, Chair of the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice Section, and welcome to our weekly Chair Chat. Today, I am so excited to have as our guest, Ms. Margaret Drew, Chair of the ABA's HIV/AIDS Impact Project, along with Michael Pates, Director of the ABA's Center for Human Rights. Welcome to both of you. Glad to have you.
Thank you.
Well, tomorrow, December 1st, is World AIDS Day. And we wanted to have this conversation with both of you to talk about World AIDS Day. Tell us what it's about, tell us why it's important, and what is planned for tomorrow.
Well, I think World AIDS Day has increasing significance both nationally and internationally. Of course, we who are old enough remember the time when there was no treatment for AIDS, and there was a lot of stigma for people who have AIDS. The stigma still continues. However, we've made advances medically, but in some parts of the lives of people living with AIDS or HIV, there remains stigma for much of what they're doing during their routine days. Many people still lack understanding of how HIV can be acquired. And also that means that there's still a lot of fear for uninformed people of those who are living with HIV. We've also seen an increase in HIV in areas where there is also infection rate due to drug use and needle sharing and so forth. And it's important for people to understand that HIV still carries significant difficulties with it for those living with HIV, both stigma in the workplace. Not everyone has access to medical treatment, and other vulnerabilities because of their medical condition, including not having active social lives when people learn that they're HIV positive, even though the medicine today can bring the viral load down to 0. So I think it's really important that there still be a lot of awareness around HIV and AIDS so that people can understand the needs of those living with HIV, why we don't need to be afraid of people who live with HIV, and how we can work together to reduce any barriers that people living with HIV encounter. Mm-hmm. Michael, you probably have additional information.
Well, I was just going to say the HIV/AIDS Impact Project tomorrow on World AIDS Day is holding a session with survivor advocates, people who have HIV and their experiences in dealing with HIV, and who have also become advocates for people with HIV/AIDS as lawyers or otherwise as advocates. And so a really interesting conversation tomorrow that this group is sponsoring and CRSJ is putting together for us. So I invite people to tune in. It's going to be a really interesting conversation.
We look forward to being part of that conversation tomorrow. You know, the U.S. government's theme around tomorrow's World AIDS Day and the whole issue around HIV and AIDS is called Putting Ourselves to the Test, Achieving Equity to End HIV. I wanted to ask you about, what does equity look like? And I'm thinking more about this in the context of, when we talk about equity, we usually talk about that in diversity, equity, and inclusion, communities of color, vulnerable communities. And I can remember very specifically, when I was in college, the world stopped on my campus when we found out that Magic Johnson had HIV. And like everyone's awareness went up everybody wanted to, run out and learn about it, read about it, understand it. What does equity look like, particularly in the context of vulnerable communities? And when I speak about my own experience, I went to a historically, HBCU. So I think about it in that context of these communities.
Michael, I didn't know if you wanted to answer this first, or I'll lead either way.
Feel free to jump in.
Well, I think that equity has a long way to go in order to achieve equity, particularly with people of color living with HIV. There are all of the access to health care issues that people of color encounter no matter what the health issue is.
Right.
But also a fear of disclosing that someone's living with HIV, in terms of both accessing healthcare, but other forms of economic justice. People being fired for disclosing is still, it's not unusual. And all of these barriers particularly impact people of color. And of course, people of color, particularly those living in the southern US, have additional barriers because there aren't as many programs to assist people living with HIV in terms of financial assistance to receive the help that they need. And also, I think that there's much more bias towards people of color, judgment on how HIV was acquired, and when that should not be a factor at all. But sadly, there are lots of judgments around how people living with HIV and particularly people of color. And as a lawyer, I'll add that the court systems, incorporate some of this bias also. So that, let's say, a mother in a custody dispute and someone of color is living with HIV, that can be used to remove custody of children, particularly because of financial reasons, there might not be any expert available to talk about the very limited circumstances on how one may become infected and how if one's taking medication, there's no risk of transfer at all. So I think this falls particularly hard on people of color, and equity is a long way off, the way I see it at the moment.
I'm glad you mentioned the term economic justice. That's the theme of our section this year, economic justice, and trying to highlight and talk about the economic justice issue, the broader context of civil rights and social justice.
Mm-hmm.
And so to hear you kind of explain the economic justice impact, it's important that our listening audience hear that and think about ways we can find solutions to address those concerns, which lead me to my next question around what was the impact that the pandemic had on communities that are disproportionately impacted by HIV and AIDS?
Michael,
or Professor Drew?
Sure. Well, actually, I think that picks up very well on Margaret's last answer. I mean, my first insight, or the insight I became aware of when I started at the ABA working on HIV/AIDS issues, is that HIV is a terrific barometer, real bellwether for the degree to which human rights are respected and protected. And so to the extent they're not, you find HIV thriving. And to the extent they are respected and protected, HIV is at least better under control. But issues like equity in the healthcare system are absolutely fully reflected in the HIV experience, only exacerbated. And one of the other insights in the data show this is that it's not a matter of behavior that increases likelihood of getting HIV necessarily. It's actually the structural inequities as other populations face them that tend to produce their susceptibility to acquiring HIV. And so the judgment and the stigma that Margaret referenced is very much at play in misperceptions about how HIV is acquired and who acquires it. From the very beginnings of the pandemic, it was about people with moral misbehavior, for example, who sort of brought it on themselves. And in fact, it's often very much not the case. It's often a result of structural factors. And in fact, you talk about the gay community in the United States being the first most directly affected. HIV has no idea who it's infecting. It just happened to hit the gay population first in this country. You look at other countries in the world, it's pretty uniformly spread out. And in fact, it's largely a heterosexual population, largely women who have HIV. And so in that sense, HIV knows no boundaries, but it is very much a bellwether for issues like equity. And I think COVID is very much, in most healthcare crises, the inequities in any healthcare system will be reflected by the results of that, healthcare situation, whether it's HIV or COVID or anything else. And so to address those situations, prevention and otherwise, is really a function of the healthcare system that's in place and how that system responds.
So
and I'd like to add also that other problems that arose with COVID was very often lack of privacy. So someone may had to be living with roommates or whatever, staying at home and couldn't get the privacy they needed for both medical discussions or psychotherapeutic discussions, or just even benefits discussions. So that restricted a lot of people that didn't have resources, because, wealthier people could just go to another room and take care of business. But that was often not the case. And of course, access to computers for Zooms or other devices was a limitation. So as with most crises that we experience, the inequities fell harder on those without resources and other marginalized people.
do either of you have statistics on the current population numbers around who's living with this disease today in America and globally? What are we talking about in terms of numbers these days?
Michael may have more information.
Well,
on
the
that.
CDC has great numbers from the United States, and the World Health Organization also has great stats. It's basically 40 million or so worldwide that currently are infected with HIV, 1.5 million globally who become infected every year. About 40 million or so have died globally. And as we've been talking about, those who are most vulnerable to infection are those who are already resource deprived, if you will, and otherwise discriminated against. And so that, again, is where the structural deficiencies of any healthcare system will only exacerbate susceptibility to HIV. And then you overlay the stigma issues like criminalization of non-HIV disclosure or HIV non-disclosure that Margaret referenced earlier, have all kinds of ripple effects through the public health system and public health consequences.
In terms of the criminalization of non-disclosure, is that an issue that the ABA has addressed through resolution of public policy? Is that an area where you believe the ABA ought to speak in drafting public policy?
Well, one of the first things, go ahead, Margaret.
Go ahead, Michael.
I was just going to say, one of the great things that what used to be the AIDS Coordinating Committee originally, and now is the HIV/AIDS Impact Project, was founded in 1987, sort of at the height of the hysteria surrounding HIV/AIDS in the United States. And the basic idea was try to bring some sense of calm and reason and thoughtful approach to dealing with the issues from a legal perspective, protecting the rights of all concerned. And so the first thing that the committee did was hold hearings nationwide about what these issues are from multiple sectors, and got really good information about how the law can respond. What was so fascinating was that the committee forwarded to the ABA an omnibus package of policies that the ABA essentially adopted wholesale. And the committee went back and looked at them a couple of years ago, and they all hold up. very well.
Good.
They did some tweaking of language and repassed those policies essentially. But even back then, criminalization was dealt with as primarily better dealt with as a public education concern, because if you criminalize HIV non-disclosure, you essentially deter people from getting tested. If they don't know that they have HIV, you can't hold them criminally liable. And so that has tremendously negative effects on getting public health grip on HIV, the spread of HIV. And so from a public health perspective, it's a disaster. But it also, modern understandings about how HIV is affected, et cetera, also inform the debate on this, and really should be no debate that HIV should not be criminalized. It doesn't make sense as a practical matter, and it certainly doesn't make sense from a public health perspective.
Margaret, do you want to add something?
Well, I would add that once again, we have a situation where science is not, the law has not caught up with the science. That not only should HIV not be criminalized for all the reasons Michael said, but the legislators and the courts have an obligation to revisit what their legislation and their case law when there have been significant changes. And most of the cases, and many of the cases where people are prosecuted, there was zero viral load, and there was no chance of infection of the partner. And yet they still were vulnerable under the existing laws for non-disclosure to the partner.
And Professor Drew, are we talking more about state law, or is this federal legislation?
Mostly state law. Okay. It would be great if there was some federal legislation, but these are state laws that need to be taken on one state at a time.
And are they in particular specific parts of the country, or is it kind of throughout the country?
No, I think that while most states have laws about infectious diseases, the focus on the AIDS and HIV population really comes out of fear and bias. So I think a lot of the litigation has focused on, I know, on Illinois, on Missouri, and other states, but it's one at a time. It also doesn't mean that, every state is criminalizing HIV or AIDS.
Right.
Mike, I don't know if you're aware of other states where there's been significant challenges to the laws.
Well, that's sort of an ongoing effort. Groups like Lambda Legal and the Center for HIV Law and Policy and other great HIV advocates out there are aggressively dealing with this issue. It actually was one that seemed to have been under control for many years, but made a sort of resurgence in the last 5 to 10 years, interestingly enough. And so again, it just goes to show that public education is generational and needs to be maintained, because until HIV is truly ended, it's going to be a situation where that kind of awareness needs to be maintained.
And speaking of that awareness, Michael, on your website for the Center for Human Rights, there's a great video that defines what it means to be a lawyer. And what I love about your video is that you focus on the word action, that lawyers are called upon to take action. I'm wondering if you could share with us, what can lawyers do to take action to be supportive of doing the work necessary to ending HIV and AIDS, and also educating the community that they may be located in around these important issues?
Well, I think you're right on the button in terms of education. That's the first thing that anybody can do as an advocate, is become steeped in the issues, and rid oneself of sort of misunderstandings and presuppositions. Again, a great resource for the facts on HIV/AIDS is CDC, NIH, World Health Organization. You really get a sense of where the pandemic is today. And then on the legal front, again, groups like the Center for HIV Law and Policy are a great reservoir of state and federal laws on virtually every issue that touches on HIV and AIDS, and will also give you access to other advocates and what they're doing. Things like right down to actual amicus briefs, to contacts with other groups. But one of the most impressive armies, if you will, of public interest lawyers I've met and have been privileged to know is the HIV legal community. Absolutely selfless, dedicated, can always use help. They're very much a public interest community in the sense that they make the most of limited resources. But the impact of that kind of work is also truly enormous, whether it's in a particular state or a county or a community or national or even global, because as Margaret alluded to, success in these kinds of cases has ripple effects far beyond the individual case, as they should. And so I would really encourage anybody who has a public health interest, if nothing else, to really focus on HIV as a great starting point for public health advocacy. You'll meet some great people doing great work, and the impact will be both rewarding and very real for the larger community.
Right. Professor Drew?
I agree on the rewards of the work. I think that the population that one works with this advocacy is quite a generous population and a good population to work with. The sad part is that there seem to be so few resources for people for what they need, as we talk about with economic justice.
Right.
But yes, and I want to reiterate what Mike said about continuous education, because now that HIV is having a bit of a resurgence because of shared needles and so forth, I think the old fears have arisen again. Right. So it is an area, and also people think that HIV and AIDS is cured, and don't understand that people who have HIV are, responsible to take what can be several medications. And that depends upon health insurance, social status, and so forth.
And for the record, there is no cure. That should be, be clear.
At this point, no.
Right. It can be controlled.
It's controlled, yes. Right. Successfully controlled, so there's no viral load. Right. But still, it needs constant medical attention and monitoring.
Right. So I know neither one of you are medical doctors and can't give a medical diagnosis, but I've been in conversations over the years where people say, well, Magic Johnson was cured.
Right.
That's not technically true.
No.
You may look healthy, you may be vibrant, but he takes medication to maintain his health status.
Absolutely.
There's been some promising results in bone marrow transplants, I think, in a very limited number of cases where, but it's still very much the subject of study and nowhere near being publicly available. But as Margaret said, the AIDS treatment today or HIV treatment is so phenomenally effective that you can be, U equals U is the undetectable is untransmittable.
Right.
And so people are leading very healthy, robust, safe lives today if they can access and maintain that treatment.
Right. And it's very expensive, obviously, for those who don't have health insurance.
Yes.
Do you have any sense of the numbers? What does it cost if you don't have health insurance? Do you have any idea what those numbers are?
Not off the top of my head, but it's exorbitant, no doubt.
Right.
Yeah.
But probably on a regular living wage income, it would be hard to maintain that level.
Almost certainly.
Yes.
Right.
So the treatment can be sporadic sometimes because of economic situation.
Right. And do most insurance plans cover this type of treatment?
As far as I'm aware, most major insurers cover it. However, many people are covered through the Ryan White funds.
Mm,
And of course, that's always subject to public funding.
right.
Um,
Can you tell
so
us what is the Ryan White Fund?
Ryan White, as you know, was, may recall, was a
Right.
young man who contracted HIV, I think through medical procedures.
Yep.
And after his death, which he, shared his situation publicly, nationally.
Right.
And after his death and recognition of him and his struggle, funds were established to help assist people with HIV. And so part of the public funding for the Ryan White Act is to assist those who are otherwise unable to afford
Right.
medical treatment.
Right.
I believe it covers other aspects as well. Michael, you might know more.
No, that sounds right. The Ryan White Care Act is the
Yeah.
enormous legislation that has become indispensable to the domestic treatment regime.
Right. Wonderful. Well, as we wrap up today's conversation, is there anything that you want us to know or that we did not cover around this important topic, specifically what we should be doing tomorrow for World's AIDS Day and beyond?
I would ask people not to minimize the seriousness of people living with HIV and the difficulties they encounter, both health-wise and stigma-wise.
Mhm.
That people, as you mentioned, like Magic Johnson, they look fine, and that's where people think it's cured,
Right.
but it's not. And even with COVID, people living with HIV were very high risk.
Mm.
So, but primarily not to stigmatize people who have this medical condition, because it makes their lives so much harder. There's so much shaming that goes on,
Right.
and it's completely unnecessary and inappropriate.
Right.
So I think if people can really respect and honor people who are living with HIV and think positively on how they can help, as opposed to being swept away with some of the stigma that's out there.
Thank you for sharing that. Michael?
The one thing I would add is the popular notions of common sense as applied to these kinds of public health issues. Where criminalization is one great example, and so is needle exchange programs, where the popular sort of common sense is that, well, of course, if somebody doesn't tell somebody they have HIV, they should be criminally responsible for that behavior. When in fact, as the data show over and over again, when you do that, you actually deter testing and you create a very difficult public health situation. It's the same with needle exchange programs. And one great thing that this committee did back in 1997 was convince the ABA House of Delegates that to support needle exchange programs that also had a component of offering treatment to people who came in for clean needles. And again, the common sense would say, well, if you give people needles, they're just going to use drugs all the more. You're going to encourage more people to use drugs. When in fact, the data show that these kinds of programs ultimately reduce the use of these kinds of drugs while also advancing the public health system, particularly when you give them repeated chances of getting into counseling and ultimately getting off drugs. They're highly, highly effective programs, but they're not the kinds of thing that you would sort of naturally think could work from a common sense perspective. And that's why understanding the data and the science are so important to actually being effective as an advocate on these issues.
And
it's still many pockets of resistance to needle exchange programs. So that's one thing that people could work on locally that would be significantly helpful.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Important information for us to share and to have for our listeners, and hopefully we'll share that with other people around the country. I want to thank again our guest today, Professor Margaret Drew, who's chair of the ABA HIV/AIDS Impact Project, and also Michael Pates, who is the director of the ABA Center for Human Rights. Thank you so much for being our guest today and educating us about this important and continued timely conversation and topic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.